we talk about Lux, what's his name? Lex Luthor. So it's Lux Luthor. We talk about Lux Luthor, our Prime Minister, who seems to be and his allies who seem to be reaching that superhero villain status. And we had another one of those stories coming out today. Cuts to disability services. Nicola Willis told Stuff that news came as a surprise, and she had not been told how dire the situation was at Whaikaha, the Ministry for Disabled Communities, before news broke on Tuesday. She said there was a briefing earlier this year warning Whaikaha was stressed, but she said that scale of the situation was not clear, the scale. It was in context of a broader briefing listing agencies that had asked for early budget decisions and the rationale for it. On balance, the decision we got to was that we would just make decisions as part of the normal budgetary process. Then on Monday, Whaikaha surprised Willis and thousands of families with disabilities, announcing it would remove funding for a range of services, including respite care. The news this week was a surprise to me. I can also confirm I had a briefing today with the minister at Whaikaha to understand their funding situation and understand what is required from the government. We've got a little bit of video here. I'm not going to play a lot of it because it's just the stand up with the disability minister coming out. And I'll play you a couple of minutes to see what she had to say today.
You've got families being told they can no longer afford wheelchairs and respite care.
No, it's not frontline cuts at all. There have been no cuts brought in for the funding. In fact, there's been 10% more put into the fund for equipment. So it is not cuts. It is a policy situation that was...
It's a little bit like there'll be no new taxes, Bomber, but there's all these fees popping up around the place and levies. No taxes, but new levies on things like registrations for cars, that kind of thing.
Set up by the previous government that has seen more than double the spend occurring in the flexible, individualised funding. That's put pressure on, obviously, the amount of money that was there to be able to be used. And so now we have to look at how we prioritise that. And the first instance must be prioritising that use for disabled people.
Why do you not consult with any of the disabled community before doing this? They were absolutely blindsided yesterday and they're really upset with you.
Yeah, look, I understand that some who have been able to access that funding, that have been using the funding, carers that have been using the funding for their personal care are upset about losing that. I will talk to Whaikaha about how announcements are made in the future. They do have a...
So very clearly, it's not a mistake that they've done it. They'll just want to make sure that Whaikaha is informed when they do it again about the communication.
A stakeholder group that they discuss things with, but this fund has blown out and they have to manage it within the fund that's there.
So that goes back just directly the whole thing to 6.5% cuts, 6.5% cuts. The problem is, though, there was an email Bomber. I don't know if you've seen this, that came out and it paints a slightly different picture. There was a leaked email accidentally sent to the wrong recipient, and it said due to financial cost and pressures on government departments, the ministry would now actively enforce a set budget cap on the provision of equipment, wheelchairs, and modification services. I wanted to notify you in advance that this is likely to result in some reduction in orders over the next few months, the email said. Today, the Disability Issues Minister said the enforcement budget caps and reductions in orders were not cuts. Penny Simmons said that, in fact, 10% more funding was being put into the fund and equipment, so contrary to this email. And finally, talking about where the greatest need funding would occur. That's what she said. And I highlighted that one sentence, Bomber, because we're hearing this a lot. We're hearing, trust us, where the greatest funding is needed, we will put it. We're hearing it in the housing situation when they're talking about the new rules around emergency housing, and they say there will always be emergency houses for those in need. And then they're also saying, but if you contribute to the reason for having your emergency housing, you may not be eligible, but there'll always be one for those who really need it. But we've got no new rules that might eliminate you, but there'll always be it. And I kind of feel the same about this. The greatest need funding will occur, where it will go to. And this, it's like they're saying it, but will they do it?
It's all part of their social investment model, which is a means of eroding universal provision of welfare. The argument is we'll put the funds in the areas who cost us the most long term, the worst of the worst, because these ones cost the state ongoing, and we'll put extra resources there at the cost of a universal provision of those services, because the universal provision of those services gets societal buy-in from the wider community. Something like free public transport gets massive buy-in from everyone who uses it. So you erode the solidarity of the universalism, you make it just the worst case scenario, and you say you fund those things. But that misses so many others who are needing help, and it's a way of almost privatizing welfare. So I'm not a believer in that system. And of course, if it's only going after the worst case ones, and it's a smaller budget required for that, well, that's less money going to the state, and that's the rights project, to constantly strangle off revenue going to the state so it doesn't have the money to redistribute in the first place. So this is the game that they're playing at the moment.
So we played something last night from John Stewart, Marty, and talking about the right trying to strangle off funding. The thing that he put out there, which I think we can align to us, is this is what the right does. When they're not in government, they say government's broken. Then they get into government, and everything they do breaks government. And then they can point at it and go, see, the government's broken because they broke it. And then they go, we have the answer. It's PPPs, it's asset sales, it's privatization. So when you mention sort of the funding and what they're doing, it's this idea that they say it's broken, they then break it, they then point to it and say, we told you it was broken.
No.
It's the plan. It's Lex Luthor. It's evil.
No. Well, and that's their constant drive. And I think because so much of their policy were lobbyist talking points for the election, and they're now desperately trying to flesh that out into actual policy without making it look as venal as it is.
Yeah.
And that's going to be tough for them because it's really, really self-interested. The deregulation program they're going to run for their donors will be as self-interested as that sounds.
The other thing that is becoming more and more evident, do you know if a sort of neoliberal government came along and they said we're gonna sort out all of the public money issues, and they started at the top, they went after white collar crime, they went after all that kind of stuff, and they worked their way down to emergency housing, you'd go, I mean, I don't like it, the vulnerable, but at least they're consistent in their messaging. But what they're doing is they're not just starting at the bottom, they're going to the bottom, and then they're getting the most vulnerable of those ones down the bottom, and they're starting with them. Because, Bomber, the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable have had it too good for too long, and we certainly need to sort those guys out, don't we?
Those state tenants, yeah. Look, here's my thoughts. Neighbours at war don't just happen amongst state tenants, eh? Mm-hmm. Like New Zealanders and everywhere, right? People sometimes, bless them, they're just assholes, and people don't like living together, right? And they start it, and that kind of friction is actually way wider than state tenants. Now, for those state tenants who are doing those sorts of antisocial behaviour things, look, how awful must that be for those who are forced to live around them? And every effort must be made to make sure people feel safe in their state homes, right? Yeah. So everybody's deserving of that. But my fear when we start throwing people out onto the streets is that these problems start to metastasize into social ill way worse than neighbours in dispute. Because what the government is suggesting is that these people just go move in with whānau if they get kicked out. Now, I don't know about you, but I know a lot of families who are just holding on by their fingernails, and if they suddenly had an incredibly unruly family have to move in, that would be enough to topple it over. I think that we need to keep people in state houses, and we've got to try and help and do a lot more investment into those state houses. throwing people out onto the street. And remember, look at the stats. 60% of those with arrears have children, and 42% of those who've had complaints have children. You throw these people onto the street, you're throwing hundreds or thousands maybe of children onto the street as well. And that's not a social policy, that's a revenge fantasy.